Welcome everyone to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable's DEI workshop, Diversity in Practice, an Allocator, Manager, and Consultant panel. I'm Mithra Warrior, a member of the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable Management Committee. I'm happy to introduce today's discussion. In my day job, I am head of prime brokerage sales for TD Securities, where I'm also a member of TD Securities Women in Leadership, and I also co-chair TD Securities Minorities in Leadership. And I hope these perspectives will add to today's discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Roundtable sponsors. We're thankful for the continued support of such a wonderful group of actively involved sponsors from within the industry. Now, a few logistical points. If you have not participated in our virtual events before, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can use this to ask questions of our speakers, which we encourage you to do. Today, we have a very diverse panel of women that includes an allocator, a manager, an ESG consultant, and a diversity practitioner. It's also a global panel, as our panelists today are joining us from North America, Europe, and Asia. Today's moderator is Christina Renberg, Senior Associate at boutique ESG advisory firm North Peak Advisory. Christina has spent her career at the intersection of finance and sustainability and brings a wealth of experience in responsible investment and ESG analysis. She joined North Peak Advisory from KKS Advisors. Her work on capital market reactions to corporate announcements of long-term strategic plans has been published in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance and the Harvard Business Review. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Christina.
Great, thank you, Mitra. It's great to be here, and really excited to have this conversation on practical solutions for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we felt like there's been a lot of discussion around why diversity is important, and we wanted to bring this to the next level by discussing kind of actions and practical steps. And to do so, I have with me three fantastic panelists as well, and I want to start by introducing our panelists. So with us today, we have Nasreen Ghazali. Nasreen is the Chief Risk Officer and member of Strategies Group of Oasis Management, based in Hong Kong. She's also the co-founder of Board Diversity Hong Kong Investors Initiative and a member of the 30% Club Hong Kong and Japan chapters. Then we have Imogen Rose Smith, and she is the co-founder of Combinate Capital, which is a financial services firm that advises on diversity, equity, and inclusion training and measurement and works with managers and asset owners. Imogen has also served on the advisory board of Girls Who Invest and is a member of the planning committee for High Water Women's Annual Impact Investment Symposium. And then last but not least, we have Tracy McHale-Stewart. Tracy is the CEO and managing partner of Corbin Capital Partners. Tracy has more than 30 years of experience in the industry and is responsible for the day-to-day management of Corbin. And she's also the chair of the investment committee and member of a private investment committee at Corbin. And Tracy has been an active voice on change on diversity in the alternative space. So before we dive in, as we all know, diversity has become one of the kind of key agenda items for this year. And there are numerous studies that have showed that diverse teams are more effective and innovative. Diversity avoids groupthink, and firms with more diverse boards have also found to be outperforming. And so in our industry, then in the alternative investment industry, there is a clear underrepresentation of women and minorities. And so that's why the question then becomes, what can we do to improve? What can we do to create a more inclusive work environment? And so to begin with, Imogen, I know that you've been working a lot with companies and investors, helping them think about diversity strategically and helping them improve. It seems to me like there's a lot of attention on the inputs, so directly on hiring. Are there some best practices that you see when it comes to hiring diverse candidates?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are a number of best practices that are evolving. There's a lot of research out there around how sort of like the language that you use in job ads, can put people off. I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that, she knows a woman who is like really qualified for a role, but the role requires her speaking German and she doesn't, and so she doesn't want to apply for that role, whereas if it was a man, they absolutely would do so. So thinking about sort of the language, how do you be more open in terms of what you're asking for, and how do you be more open into sort of asking for people who come from different types of backgrounds and different types of experiences. And then there are things like, what are the interview techniques that you use? How do you, again, sort of not be, and I think it's difficult, particularly difficult in the alternative investment industry, because we're so used to being told to sort of find people who fit in, who kind of like look like everyone else. So when that's been your sort of mindset for 20, 30 years, and you're sort of profiling for people like you, it's very hard to sort of reboot that and say, actually, we want to find people who are different from us. So there are standard things that you can do in terms of sort of language and recruiting and hiring. And then something that we've been working a lot on recently is networks. Like, how do you look outside of your own network? So, we work with people to identify what are the skill sets and the expertise that you lack. Where might you go to find that is outside of, your LinkedIn community or your alumni networks or the typical places you might look. So how do you look beyond where you would normally go? But I think that what we tend to see is people really sort of fixate on the hiring and recruitment side, and because they want a fast solution, right? They just want to be able to say, and we see this a lot, particularly with entrepreneurs, but I would say it's also true of hedge funds. Like, they just want to be like, get me the resumes of people who are different, and then we're done. And it's really like, you can find the people, right? The people and the exist, and there are a lot of incredibly talented people out there. It's really about how do you include that person in your company. So it's like, called diversity, equity, and inclusion for a reason. Like, if they're not part of the organization, if they're not bid into the actual business, then those people aren't going to succeed and they're not going to thrive. And you're not going to see, diverse teams outperform, but they like, well-managed diverse teams outperform, poorly managed diverse teams underperform. They're going to thrive when they're happy. If you're just doing this as sort of like tokenism and, oh God, we have to do it because, the public pension plans are jumping up and down, it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's great. And so there seems to be, a lot more elements to the actions that should be taken, and, hiring diverse talent alone doesn't really fix the problem. It's more like thinking about the barriers that you have internally as well, and how people have the same opportunities to succeed internally. And I mean, for Nasreen and Tracy, you focus on diversity both within your own firms, but then also on how diversity is important in the investment process itself. How do you think about diversity then in your firm, first of all, and then secondly in the investment process? Nasreen, would you like to go first?
Yes, sure. Hi. Thank you for having me today. In our organization, yes, definitely. So I have been an investment professional for 21 years now in Paris and Tokyo and Hong Kong for the last 13 years, trading in banks and then in hedge fund industry. And for my whole career, I really witnessed the lack of diversity and the lack of role model. In my current firm, where I'm the chief risk officer at Oasis, we do have a natural diversity in terms of nationality and language, because we are in Asia, headquartered in Hong Kong. So we have people from Hong Kong Chinese, mainland Chinese, Japanese, French, American, etc. So even if our team is 40 people, we have, I think, around 10 nationalities. So we do have a broad diversity of nationalities and culture. And what we want to do within our firm, because we really believe in diversity of thinking, we want to encourage a culture where we nurture the dialogue. So even the most junior analyst is encouraged to challenge the CIO. We have this very horizontal hierarchy where we want everyone to have a voice, and we really like this diversity of thinking. So that's how we do it in our firm. We also do it as part of our more like ecosystem in Hong Kong, being part of a lot of organizations, the one you mentioned, like the 30% Club, the Hong Kong Board Diversity Initiative that we co-founded. We participate in all the consultations from the Hong Kong Exchange, or just one that closed last week in Japan about the Corporate Governance Revision Code, where we advocate for at least one woman director in every board of listed companies in Japan. And then because we see the interest of diversity on the trading floor, we also want to implement that in our investment. So the next step is really to look at the diversity at the top management and on the board of our invested companies, engage with our invested companies for better diversity. Next step is also to use our proxy voting against management or board for lack of diversity. And for our firm at Oasis, we go even further, where we engage very deeply with companies we invest in, bringing a plan with operation improvements, but also corporate governance improvements. So we do the analysis of the board, and sometimes we even push for some from female candidates to have a better diversity on investee boards.
Yeah, that's great. And Tracy, for you then in your firm and also when you're looking at managers, are there some specific things that you're focusing on?
Yeah, so for my firm, years ago, I really looked at this and looked at all this sort of hard research on what's called a diversity bonus, which, Christina, is what you addressed, really, that there are better outcomes with diverse teams. And, it's funny, people get this with sports teams, right? Different players, different roles, different skill sets. They get it in portfolios, but haven't really gotten it with teams of people. But when I did that work, I presented at a client conference. It helped my team, at least conceptually, to start to understand the concept. I've seen, and Nazreen, you sort of got at this, the impact also of non-diverse teams and groupthink within my organization. And I've seen bad outcomes from it. So, we've done a lot to really encourage challenging viewpoints, junior people to speak up, et cetera. And that has created process improvement. So we've really seen it. We know how important it is. I'd say at the firm level, we've been working on it for a while with modest results. And I've learned a few things. I'll just kind of walk you through those themes. One is you need to create real intentionality around the issue. Like we're a woman-run firm. I've been focused on it. But, the work has until recently yielded little, quite frankly, in our firm, because I didn't create like a big strategic priority. So you kind of have to be honest, realize there's a lot of work to do. Our industry is really, really not good on the issue, and commit to it, commit to learning and improving. So commit to action, realize none of us, except for a couple of you on the panel, are diversity experts, right? In our business, that's not what we do. So recognize it. Reach out for help. Tremendous resources are available. So find the right ones for your firm. We've done it. We're working with experts. It's really, really, they shed so much light on the topic. And Imogen, you addressed this, but focus on inclusion. Diversity is always the key word here. If you don't get inclusion right, you won't keep your employees, your diverse employees. So, ensure you're doing the work to make sure everyone feels welcome, included, valued, empowered, all of that. And that's work. That doesn't just happen by accident. We're sort of going through it at Corbin right now. These programs always have unintentional bias training, but I think intentionality training, and there can be various things related to that, or inclusivity training is really important. You know, it's an overused term, but diversity is being invited to the dance or the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. So really being included. I'd say also create role models, even if they're not at your firm. The importance of people, seeing people who look like them in leadership positions can't be, you know, encouraged enough. It changes perceptions, it inspires, it embeds confidence. Super important. We work with a group called Girls Who Invest, who, you know, they create training. Well, Imogen, you were on the board. They create training and internships for college women. And the feedback we get from these women, just being exposed to an asset management firm run by a woman is tremendous. So you've got to find role models for your people. And then, you know, this is where the experts come in. You know, do the work to kind of look under the hood of your employees and figure out what's really going on with the underrepresented groups. You can datafy this, you know, evaluate it, create goals, create, you know, initiatives, do it transparently. It's funny, if you think about all the analysis that goes into our investment work that we do, right, to create portfolios, why are we not applying analysis to hiring, mentoring, you know, retaining, promoting people? It should be. This work just doesn't happen with platitudes. So, you know, that's what I've learned. On the investment process, it's the same thing. Our investment team is insufficiently diverse. We're working on it. We've encouraged diverse thinking. We need to get more diversity onto the team. But I'd say we have at our firm, we've split the business management and the investment management up. I do one, our CIO does the other. We are very, very different profiles. And that diversity of thinking has really contributed to our success.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think this kind of also relates to, or at least something that we hear quite often at North Peak, is that there's a lot of managers who maybe struggle with that starting point, or like actually framing that intentionality, and they might just stop at having a statement. And then when you start asking them about an actual plan or how they're planning to kind of reach those targets or whatever actions that they have set out, there's not much more thought that has gone into it. And so, Imogen, actually, are there, from your side, you know, when you work a lot on improving diversity in practice with teams, are there some kind of common mistakes that you see managers making when they're starting on focusing on improving their diversity and inclusion specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, yes, I mean, again, I think we sort of touched on this, but this surface level, just let's get some resumes and get some diverse people in seats as quickly as possible, and then hope it'll all be fine approach doesn't work, right? You need to be thoughtful about it, and you need to understand, you know, why are you doing this, right? And I think where we really see sort of the penny drop for people is when they understand, you know, you're doing this really for two reasons. One, it's going to make you a better, more robust organization over the long term, and because it's the right thing to do. And I think that kind of like, because it's the right thing to do, part of the conversation wasn't really a big part of the conversation until sort of the last couple of years. Because we had this kind of idea that like these kind of like not ethics exactly, but these kind of issues somehow stopped at the investment office door, and that like we shouldn't talk about like the fact that it's the right thing to do. We should only talk about performance because, you know, blah blah blah, fiduciary duty. And I think understanding that we do this because the cultures that we have matter is really important. And when you see that penny drop and you see people realize, okay, you know, I can build a better firm, that's when real change starts to happen. And so, yeah, sort of the common mistakes are sort of not seeing that, doing it like, and not, I think a lot of people, well, yeah, I think a lot of people are scared to talk about these issues because they lack the language. And so I think that you have to, like most people, you know, diversity training often fails because it becomes really alienating. People don't like to be told, you know, that they're bad people, and they're probably not bad people. But they need to have ways to understand, to sort of speak about this and discover a language that, and it's difficult because, like, you know, a lot of times you see people saying things that are ridiculous, right? But they need to find ways to speak about it that reflect where they are, but also sort of like move them forward. So, and I think sort of Tracy's point, like, it's really hard work, and doing this the right way requires rolling up your sleeves, doing the hard work, being sensitive and nuanced about it, but also not being sort of terrified of the whole thing. And yeah, I mean, the other thing is, I mean, obviously it needs to be integrated into compensation. Like, if you don't make it something that people actually have to do, then they won't really do it. Like, you have to mean it. And then, I mean, the last thing I would say is, but also be sincere about where you are. Like, I'm a big advocate of like meeting people where they live. Like, don't put out a diversity and inclusion statement when you're all a bunch of white men, because you're not diverse and inclusive, and it's not your fault. But be honest about it and try and figure out how to come up with solutions, rather than thinking, and it might be your fault, like, but rather than thinking that you can just kind of like wish it into being. Like,
yeah, this like transparency and just like being genuine about where you are on the journey.
Yeah, and having empathy, like, is really important. And, you know, again, like, don't say, my least favorite phrase is, you know, as the father of daughters, I now understand this, right? That is the worst possible thing to say. And you mean, like, people who say that mean well, but like, that's halfway there. You need to be able to say, no, I understand this because I can be empathetic to people who are not like me.
Yeah.
That's my big word.
And what,
don't say that.
that makes sense. And what do you think, Nasreen, you know, from your point of view, what are the main challenges that you've experienced, or the kind of mistakes in that sense that you've kind of come across when implementing it in practice?
I think we still need to do work to have more gender diversity in the investment team. That's for sure. I think it is a bit better than in 2000 when I was one of the 3 traders out of a 60 trader floor. But still, we definitely don't have enough gender diversity in the investment team, and we're doing effort on the hiring side of things. One of the mistake I have seen in the hedge fund industry, I have been talking to a lot of other funds in the Hong Kong Board Diversity Initiative, right, to have more signatories joining us. We are a group of money managers, asset manager, pension funds, and hedge funds. And one of the common mistake I hear is like, we are a small firm. We don't have any women on our board. We don't have a single woman in our investment team. So how can I join you and be part of that effort as an investors to push investing companies for more diversity? But I think we have to start somewhere, right? As individuals, as group individuals, as firm, it's not like all or nothing situation like very often in ESG. So I think that's one of the common mistakes. And to go back to Imogen's point, I think that if you're a hedge fund and you don't see the benefit of diversity, I think now, especially after 2020, the COVID crisis and Me Too movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, there is a real push from our own investors to work on ESG issues, including diversity. So we really observe on our side a lot of requests from our investors around those issues because they definitely want to be playing a role for setting those priorities globally. So we really do see that.
Yeah. And Tracy, do you see similar kind of challenges and trends also from your side?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything I'm hearing from the other panelists, I just want to reiterate. But we're working on this. We've hired consultants, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it because it kind of shows how hard it is. One firm we hired uses data, big data, and AI to sort of they do a survey of your employees, their demographics, their identities, their experiences, put all this together, and they benchmark it against peer data. This group has worked very extensively in asset management. I mean, the goal is to identify what they call pain points, which is biases and problems that hold your organization back from being more inclusive. And so it goes beyond, like, I think Imogen said, that the generic number crunching, I hired so many people of color or whatever. It goes beyond that to really look at people's experiences under the hood and the opportunities they feel they're given. And our pain points, I mean, despite, again, my focus, a woman-run firm, what came out of this is that employees really broadly felt this was a white male-dominated organization with very conventional biases, which is like, a gut punch to me. It's just not what I wanted to hear. And our scores by women of what they perceived as our efforts to recruit and hire underrepresented groups were quite low. So, we have a lot of work to do. And I'll say through this work, I've recognized, and the research really supports this, despite working with people, Imogen, you referred to this, and meeting them where they are and trying to work on like unconscious bias and all that stuff. The reality is de-biasing minds is very hard. It's easier to de-bias the processes. So, a lot of research has been done on the fact that we are all hardwired, going back to caveman days, to really be much more comfortable with people that look, sound, and act like us. It's just in our DNA. So it's not an evil plot, it's just there. And that's hard to reverse and it's hard to recognize. But there's a lot of work that's been done in recruiting and in all of it, in the whole process through promoting people and de-biasing the processes to help you with this work.
Yeah. Are there any kind of examples of, or how could you demonstrate that you've actually made progress on those kind of factors? Because they must be really hard to actually measure. I'm just curious, like, was there any kind of follow up, for example, from that?
Imogen, you might have more on this, or Christina, with the work you do, but we're early days in the process, right? So we've just collected and reviewed the data, and they have come up with all these initiatives, a lot of initiatives. And the way we'll know if we're making progress is we will survey regularly, and people were really honest. I read the feedback, people were honest. So we'll know, I mean, the obvious stuff is when we have a more diverse, workforce or employee base. But when we get the feedback that the underrepresented groups really feel that this is a diverse organization that's not white male dominated. And, I just know we'll work better together. People will be happier. We'll be more creative. So many good things will come out of that. And that's just within our organization. There's work we're trying to do with hiring managers as well. And I'll say we have not been super successful hiring Black, brown, and women investment firms. We outreach, and there's actually recently a lot more groups focused on it that we're tapping into that we think will broaden our pool. But, that's sort of, we have the challenge of internally creating diversity, but then externally really finding different, more underrepresented groups is another, perhaps bigger challenge, right? But we're focused on it.
Yeah. Imogen, is there anything on the measurement side or progress side that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to this measurement question a bit, I think Christina, you hit on like the question, which is how do you know this is being successful? So one of the things that we try to do is we measure both organizational diversity, and by that, I mean diversity very broadly speaking. And it's an important question to ask yourself, which is like, what do we mean by diversity? Because on one level, it is about hiring women and underrepresented minorities. And on the other level, it's also about having this diversity of experience and expertise. So we measure that, and then we also sort of try and measure. So we call that the diversity IQ, and then we also try to measure the EQ, which is effectively how well is that diversity functioning within an organization. What are people's sort of views and biases and questions like that, and see how those two things link up. Because if you only have one, then it's very difficult. But yeah, and I mean, look, like, yeah. It's not like it's not known that diversity and inclusion is a problem in the asset management industry. It's been known for like 20 years, right? Emerging manager programs have been around forever. So I think what has changed now is there's a real seriousness in trying to tackle these problems, and a sort of recognition that, like, you know, we are the problem, like we as the industry need to fix this, and there's an urgency and a seriousness around doing it.
Yeah, it's a systemic issue in that sense, that it's a problem that expands beyond, you know, just the internal workplace that you have.
And that's where I do think, you know, you need to address the pipeline problems as well, right? Like you need people saying, okay, so we're quants and there really aren't that many diverse people in quants, so let's go out and like make that better. Like it's not like we can just sit here and twiddle our thumbs and wonder why it's not working. We have to figure out the solutions.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about internal actions actually, and you know, what you all have kind of experienced and been working on. I know, Nasreen, you've also been really engaged kind of with kind of the external as well, and with the ecosystem in which you operate. What do you think is important when it comes to kind of creating systemic change?
Yeah, I think that if anything, what we experienced in 2020 really showed that it's not just a trend, but it's a structural change. Let me just give you an example of what we experience when we engage with investing company. One of the things we do is trying to have this constructive dialogue and asking them for more diversity. And we're talking about big listed companies in Asia. Often the answer we have when we ask them why they never had, for instance, a woman on their board for the last 12 years since the IPO, they would say, we couldn't find any candidate internally. And we're talking about companies of like 60,000 people. Then the next step is they would look for a woman in the industry, and still they can't find one. Then often they go to academia and maybe they can find one. But basically, this is really to show the fact that the feedback we get is that it's such a risk to choose a woman to go on the board. It's almost there is an introspection to try to find what are the missing skills, and they want to find this perfect unicorn to fill all the missing skills, and that could be the first female candidate that would be felt like less of a risk. Our thinking is really to work hard on engaging and to work on convincing these companies to have a change, because here in Asia, we are pretty late in terms of diversity versus the US and Europe. And this is probably because of the way the shareholding work in Hong Kong and in China. A lot of family-owned companies. So there are more and more questions around quotas, but we want to work on convincing people of the benefit of diversity and not just doing a check in the box exercise. It's a long-term effort, but it's really happening now in Asia.
And that's a really good point, because I mean, first of all, like diversity in action might look really different depending on the industry, but then even when you look at the region, there are, very clear differences, because just the starting point when it comes to diversity is so different, or the regulatory environment is so different. And I think from our point of view, in Europe, for example, what we've seen is a lot of focus on cognitive diversity. I know you also, Nasreen, you mentioned that also earlier. And then, for example, a lot of focus on parental leave and trying to make family equality easier, things like that. It would be really interesting to hear a bit more about the Asian kind of the challenges that you see there, and what kind of the solutions kind of that you're thinking about given the regional context.
I mean, it's a fair point. One of the big issues we have in the region is helping women in managing all their duties and being able to advance at work. So I'm not sure it's that different from other parts of the world, especially after a year of COVID, where women have been on the front line for all those issues. But there is definitely, I guess, like everywhere else, you tell me guys, a lot of thinking around work adjustment, work from home versus work at the office. It's quite different by jurisdictions here, but there have been a big effort, at least from financial institutions and from asset managers and hedge funds around that flexibility. Even though, for instance, in Hong Kong, we have all the state workers are back at the office. I think that there is a trend of changing the work arrangement, even if it felt like impossible before for like investment roles. That is probably a change we will see going on.
Yeah, and is that similar in the States then, Tracy and Imogen?
Yeah, look, the good news is the past whatever year or two has catalyzed the industry, whereas in the past there just was very little focus, especially in the alternatives world. I was seeing one of our credit managers a few years ago, and I'm looking at their pitch book with all white men, and they were bringing on an intern who was a white man from the same school, whatever. And I said, wow, you guys should really look at girls who invest, and I'm sort of going on about it. And they looked at me cross-eyed, literally, like didn't even pick up on it. And now I'd say nearly all of our hedge fund managers are interested. They get that they need to do something. They don't know what to do, especially smaller firms, but they get it. So that's the good news, right? So there's been a shift. We have so much work to do, but there's been a shift. And there's also now many groups out there. I mean, groups like yours, and there's a group called the Diverse Asset Management Initiative. There's something called the Due Diligence 2.0 pledge, started by a group of BIPOC managers that want to move money to that industry and change the sort of rigid due diligence process for allocating. There's a Black hedge fund professional network. There's now all these groups out there. So you need to find them and do the work and connect and broaden your pool. And just, I think if all these groups sort of work together and connect, and we need to advocate and just push the industry forward. But the good news is finally, I believe the industry is open to it.
Yeah, I mean, when I used to do ESG due diligence on hedge funds, we would look at diversity, and you'd have like alternative investment firms in general. You'd have like a Texas-based firm that was investing in oil and gas companies, and you'd be like, well, I see you have a lot of white men, and they'd say, yes, well, it's very hard. There are not many women in the oil and gas sector in Texas. And you say, fair enough, fair point. But then, you would look at who their assistant, I would always ask like what is the diversity of their assistants? And you'd find that it was like a whole bunch of underrepresented minorities and women of color. And you just think like that tells you a lot about how they view the world. You think you've got to be able to find like some 20-year-old white Texan boy to bring you coffee. Like, diversity, it's got to be about bringing people into the entire industry. And until, we're really talking about diverse candidates in investment seats, we have not succeeded. And yes, it's about having diversity throughout your organization, but it has to be holistic. So, and I think, with COVID, it's one of the big unknown, we saw that, women in particular were impacted both in terms of losing jobs and in terms of sort of managing childcare at the same time as working and taking on a lot of that stress. On the flip side, COVID has demonstrated that people can work very well and function from home. So this idea of having flexibility within the workforce could be really powerful. The irony is what you're seeing sort of the major investment banks and other people like that really, really demand people back in the office. So I think the great unknown is going to be, are these conversations really going to happen? Are we going to recognize the need of flexible work opportunities for, different types of people? And can we really start to accommodate that? Or are the sort of, white men who sit at the top of a lot of these organizations going to somehow sort of continue to feel threatened to that and sort of demand this fidelity to sort of, a whatever that is, like 7:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. office schedule while they hang out in the Hamptons?
Christina, if I could just add to that, I think the good news here is young people are on the right side of this. So you're going to get a collective mass at some point that's just going to force change. I agree on the banks. They're all requiring it. I think it's absurd. But they'll shift slowly, but we're going to have a lot of people on our side pretty soon that just young people will demand this.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I'm conscious we have 15 minutes left and we have a few questions still to cover. So it seems, just as a kind of summary of a couple of things that we've discussed, we talked about the importance of training, we talked about the importance of intentionality, we talked about understanding the kind of regional context, and also, understanding the kind of constraints of being a small team versus having a large team, and so on, and some trends for the future as well. Are there any kind of, like, if you had to give kind of 3 actions for a small fund manager that is not very diverse at the moment, are there anything specific in terms of where they should start? Who wants to take that? Maybe
you're talking about hiring, start just within their own teams, or anything?
Overall, in terms of creating a more inclusive culture, I would say.
Okay, I'm going to leave that to the experts. I have opinions, but
I can
you're much more well versed than I.
No. But I think your input would be valuable. But I think, again, sort of be honest about where you are, and understand why you are where you are and the reasons for change. I don't put out a DEI policy just to have one. Do it because you understand where you are and where you're trying to go. And then, I think look at your hiring and your recruitment processes and how you get to where you are. Identify where the challenges in the system are and try and be a part of the solution. So, recognizing you might only be hiring one person a year into your team, but how can you ensure, help and support the pipeline so that even if the person that you bring on board isn't diverse, you're helping the whole industry grow and be better. And so that likely means reaching out to organizations like Twago, Girls Who Invest, other groups, and going to universities, like using your network and the things that you're good at to figure out how can we solve this industry problem. And then, the third thing that we haven't talked about is service providers, and who do you work with, and how can you encourage diversity within, we've talked a bit about within your investment portfolio, but also like the law firms that you use, the accountants that you use, all of these organizations that you work with, how can you work with them to have better and diverse representation, so that even if you organizationally are not diverse today, you're helping the industry become more diverse, and that over the long term, you plan to get there. But again, I do think it comes down to sort of being honest about who you are and where you're at. I think that was 3 things, basically.
Yeah. Hey, Christine, we've started this thing for hiring. 40% of the candidates need to be female, 30% need to be, BIPOC. And the recruiters are so much more focused on it now. They're so much better. You need to widen the lens when you recruit, and not just say, the profile needs to look like this, which is every person you've hired for the past 10 years. But there's something called skill mapping, where, match skills to the role as opposed to the exact experience. So you can be a lot more creative there. I've said this, but hire experts, hire someone to help you with this. We don't know how to do it, right? We don't know how to do it on their own. There's a lot of good people out there. And my other comments about debiasing the processes, one of the recommendations we got was, among many other things, but when you're promoting someone, when a manager's promoting someone, they need to talk about everyone else on their team and why they're not promoted, to sort of take the bias out of it, or that's the intent anyway. There's been a lot of research on this. There's people that know how to do it. But it really, Google, Amazon, those groups in their hiring have done a lot of work on this. Debias the processes, because humans just, we're all biased in some way. That's just the way we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Nasreen, any comments from your side?
Sure. I will just add that, in Asia, we really see that change. We are like in a kind of inflection point. For instance, in Japan, Japan added like millions of women to the workforce over the past 6 years with womenomics. So we are seeing that. And I think to come back to our industry, I would really advocate to use again all the groups, industry groups out there, and ask for help. Imogen and Tracy told about them as well. But like, for instance, we have in Hong Kong, the Women Foundation, the 30% group, which have mentoring programs. So really to retain talents and help female investment professionals to grow, and also give them a role model. I totally agree, it's so important. We also have these programs to try to convince students to come to our industry. So I think really we have more and more of those groups and that effort. So I will really advocate to start by joining those, listen, talk about it internally, create a group of a forum for discussion around those issues within your organization. That would be my view.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. I think we have a lot of very actionable kind of solutions here that I think, depending on the size of the firm or where you're located, you can kind of start choosing which ones are most relevant in that sense, and which makes sense to the strategy of the firm as well. Yes, so we have a couple of questions. So for example, on training, I know that we talked about training in terms of the unconscious biases and things like that. Are those, and maybe this is a question, Imogen, specifically for you, are those kind of the key things that everyone should be trained on, or are there kind of specific topics that you would recommend when it comes to training?
So I'm sort of pitching my book a bit with this answer because, there's a lot of work and research that shows that sort of pure unconscious bias training is not effective. You see a lot of examples that, like, the classic example is like all the Google employees went to some diversity training course and they all wore t-shirts saying something, I can't remember what it was. Like, it builds up a lot of resentment within organizations when you do diversity training, because you're basically telling people that they're prejudiced. And so it's important to understand what unconscious bias is, and it's important to understand that we all have unconscious bias, but the way in which you go about teaching that and unpacking that is also sort of essential. So what we do in our work is we don't start with unconscious bias. We start by explaining why diversity is important and then how you might solve for it. And we talk about issues like tribalism. And we have sort of exercises that nudge people to slightly change their behavior, so that by doing small changes, their sort of aperture and their world opens up. So absolutely, it's important to, and there's a lot of literature out there, and there are some really good books. There's one called by Scott Page, a professor, does a lot around diversity and difference and why it's important. And there's a lot of sort of work around behavior. There's a lot of literature around behavioral change and how you can change your behaviors. That kind of like having those, and professors at Harvard do a lot. There's a woman who's a professor at Harvard University who does a lot on this as well. Like having those types of conversations and identifying that type of training, that is useful. But just sort of wheeling someone in to tell people to like knock it off and being, isn't going to work because it's unconscious bias, right? It doesn't work if you tell people that they're just horrible human beings. Like, it has to be, so, and a lot of it is, picking the right people to work with, finding a program. Again, I've heard horror stories about diversity training where people just come in and like yell at people. Like, it's finding the right partners to work with on those kind of programs.
Something that we've seen as well is that, also like training, different teams within the organization, whether it's, at the executive level, the content might be a little bit different than if you train at the employee level. Is that something that you've come across?
Yeah, we've definitely seen that. And I think that, boards are different from, again, executives from leadership. And we use like a lot of case studies as examples to sort of show what works and what doesn't work. But again, it's about understanding group dynamics and getting, because the flip side of this is, most people want to do the right thing, right? And so it's finding that language and coming up with action plans and executing on them. So again, saying next time you hire, you're going to go out, you're going to write down who's in your network, what else do you want to add, how might you go about doing that, and then delivering on that, and having sort of steps that people can achieve to really make a difference, instead again of just making people feel bad about themselves.
Yeah.
But Tracy, I'd be interested to get sort of what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything you said that yes, and advisors we've talked to about it. And I think the research is super clear. And the unconscious bias trainings, I think increasingly people are like, it probably doesn't hurt, depending on how it's done, but there's so many other things to do. The group we're working with right now, they've recommended so many things. One is inclusive mentorship training. One is inclusive promotion training. One is allyship training. So I don't even know what these things are. We haven't done it yet, but there's just a lot, and a lot of it's subtle and complicated. A group we talked to would lead the whole kick off the process with something they called awkward dinners, which, you know, to your earlier emotion, is to get everyone in the room and not accuse or attack or blame, and, you know, more lighthearted over dinner, right? But just force those conversations that we're also uncomfortable discussing around race, just to start getting that moving. We haven't done that yet, but I thought that was a super interesting idea. So again, I think lots to do, but, you know, for most of us, we can't do it on our own. We just don't have the expertise.
Excellent. Well, thank you. This has been a really, really interesting conversation, and I feel like we've covered a lot of different aspects, both when it comes to inputs and then also outcomes of the kind of diversity actions. So I want to thank you all panelists for joining the conversation today.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Nazreen, Imogen, and Tracy, for your unique perspectives on what is an increasingly important yet evasive topic for our industry. You've given us a lot to think about. I particularly like the actionable steps that all of you gave, and also the examples of what maybe some mistakes are and what haven't worked. So we really appreciated all of your insights. Thank you to everyone who attended the event. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. And please be on the lookout for information on our next few events, which will be coming out over the next few days. So stay safe, stay healthy, enjoy the rest of your week, everyone, and thank you so much.